I'm Andy Grogan-Kaler. I'm an associate professor in the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I want to talk in this section of the course about why do we do research on social issues and social problems. So I'm going to start this section or this discussion with something that really is going to be no surprise to anybody, that there is a large amount of inequality and injustice and suffering in the world. I think about some of the areas in which I do research, for example, research on intimate partner violence. The Centers for Disease Control will estimate that 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 9 men will experience some form of intimate partner violence here in the United States. Something else I look at is the use and the outcomes associated with physical punishment of children. And what you'll see in this diagram is that most children around the world live in countries where they aren't formally or legally protected from the use of physical punishment. On the right-hand side, we're talking about a recent conversation. We've started talking about these adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, experiences like experiences of being neglected or abused when you're growing up in a home where a parent is incarcerated or a parent is experiencing mental illness. Research is suggesting that those kinds of adverse childhood experiences have profound consequences across the lifespan, and they are much more common than we've understood up to date. So we, as a profession of social work, we are in the business of providing interventions and treatments and programs, and something of which I think we're not often aware is that social interventions are sometimes only partially successful, and some interventions have no effect. This is an illustration from an organization called 80,000 Hours. 80,000 Hours has highlighted findings in a number of different fields: education, employment and training, medicine, even business. And what they find in this review is that across a wide variety of domains, a wide set of activities, there's a lot of evidence that the kinds of treatments and programs and interventions that we provide actually have very little to no effect. Lastly, I want to mention that we have even found that some interventions have undesired, harmful, or what we call iatrogenic outcomes. So this is a chart from an article by Scott Lilienfeld, who's a psychologist at Emory University. And he highlights in this chart a number of interventions that have negative effects. What we particularly have come to recognize is that interventions, group-based interventions for young people who are experiencing aggressive or antisocial or delinquent behavior, sometimes those group-based interventions have exactly the opposite effect of what we would hope, that coming together in a group leads to increases in delinquency rather than decreases. So we worry that some interventions may actually be harmful, and in some cases clients may be better off not having experienced the intervention at all. So how do we think about these kinds of issues? I want to highlight the fact that intuition is only a rough guide to solutions, and you might think of the rest of the course, the rest of the modules of the course, as a systematic way of thinking about appropriate solutions. Here I just want to talk about the fact that intuition is only a very rough guide. I'm going to start with the Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study. This is an example from the early 20th century. This is a study of 506 young men born in the 1920s and the 1930s. They were involved in a mentoring program. So an older adult provided mentoring, advice, and counseling to these young men who all of them came from somewhat disadvantaged circumstances. Something I think that is worth emphasizing is that mentoring was seen as enjoyable by everybody who participated. So the young men who participated, they thought this was an enjoyable activity, meeting with their mentors. The mentors themselves found this to be an enjoyable and beneficial activity. It's only later evaluation found undesirable results. So the intervention actually was harmful rather than helpful. We see some results such as treatment group boys died on average 5 years younger. A larger number of the treatment group went on to commit more crimes than those in the comparison group. And those from the treatment group were more likely to have a diagnosis such as alcoholism or schizophrenia. Let's think about another way in which intuition can deceive us. This is an example thinking about mental health. The same set of principles would apply if we were thinking about physical health. So I'm going to start with a question: what if you received a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, or some other health disorder that was said to be 95% accurate? When I ask this question of my classes, most of them say that, well, if the tests were 95% accurate, they would be very worried by such a diagnosis. We want to think more closely about what we might think if this was a rare condition. What if the actual condition of depression or anxiety that we're diagnosing is actually rare in the underlying population? And this leads to some counterintuitive findings. Let's think about 1,000 hypothetical people. And let's think about a case in which this underlying disorder, let's say it's depression, is a rare disorder that only 1 out of 10 people experiences. That means in reality, we're going to have 100 positive cases. We're going to have 900 negative cases. Now we're going to make a decision with our screening instrument, which is 95% accurate. We're going to make a decision whether or not we think that a diagnosis is warranted. Out of these 100 positive cases, we're going to have 95 true positives, and we're going to have 5 false negatives. That comes from a 95% accurate test. But the same 95% principle applies when we think about the negative cases. We are going to have 855 true negatives, but we're going to have 45 false positives. What you will see here, if you start to think about it, is that of the diagnosis, of the positive diagnoses, of the diagnoses that this person indeed has a case of depression, 95 of those diagnoses are going to be true positives, 45 are going to be false positives. So even though this test is supposedly 95% accurate, approximately a third of the diagnoses are going to be false positives, and this comes from a case where this is actually a rare disorder out there in reality. The last example I want to talk about to try to think about how our intuition may confound us is to think about treatment for a mental health disorder. And I often think about this idea of let's talk about 2 things at a time. Let's compare 2 things at a time with 3 things at a time. So we are well equipped to think about 2 things at a time. We're well equipped to look at a graph, and you can look at a graph here. There's 2 groups of people. Every dot on the graph is a person, and we're thinking about the amount of treatment that individuals got and whether their mental health got better. What this graph illustrates is that as treatment dose goes up, mental health appears to be getting better. And so that's the conclusion that we might draw. We might decide that this is an intervention that we should implement based upon this kind of data. We're less well-suited, much less well-suited to thinking about 3 things at a time. This is the same graph. We have the same dose of treatment. We have the same better mental health. We have 2 groups of people. Again, we can draw an overall trend line suggesting that as one gets a higher dose of the intervention, mental health goes up. But pay attention to what we've done on this graph. We've added a 3rd construct or a 3rd variable. We now know that people in this group are lower socioeconomic status. People in this blue group are higher socioeconomic status. What we see is that within each group, the trend line, in fact, goes down. The overall trend line went up, but within each group, the average trend line goes down. We think that's a more accurate conclusion. Now we know about 3 things. We know about dose of treatment, we know about better mental health, we know about the socioeconomic status, and it looks like people of a higher socioeconomic status get more treatment, they have higher mental health. People of a lower socioeconomic status, they get less treatment, they have lower mental health. But again, within each group, there is a negative trend line. It looks like once we understand the world a little more completely, once we've told a slightly more complete story about the world, we understand that this treatment is harmful rather than helpful. In conclusion, I started talking, there is, as I think we will all agree, there's a lot of vulnerability, hurt, and suffering in the world. We, as a profession of social work, we are charged to address these issues. Our intuitions are often a very poor guide to thinking about the relationship of complex patterns of risk factors, treatments, interventions, and outcomes. Therefore, we need research, we need the topics that we're going to cover in the rest of this course to structure our thinking and to give us a better guide to the relationships of risk, protective factors, treatments, interventions, and outcomes.